Good afternoon, Gary.
Good afternoon, David.
I have Gary Sidley here with me, who is a retired psychologist and has recently done some really powerful work on pointing out who's behind a lot of the manipulation and the nudges and the behavioral science over the last few years. So before we get going, Gary, can you just give us a few minutes of your background in your career?
Okay, so in a nutshell, when I left school, I went to university to study the proper sciences, so they called, biochemistry, physiology, and I qualified with a degree in biochemistry, physiology combined in 1979. By then, my interest was starting to move towards mental health. And so what I did once I'd graduated was to get a job in I guess, the bottom tier of the psychiatric nursing profession, and that was as a nursing assistant on an acute admission ward. And I worked there for 12 months, which was a really valuable experience. To know what the real world was around and the level of distress that many people experience. I then went to do my psychiatric nurse training. I qualified as a psychiatric nurse in 1984 and worked in that profession up until 1987, and then went off to do my clinical psychology training, qualifying in 1989. So I've been working as a clinical psychologist in the NHS since 1989, but obviously working more years in the NHS as a nurse prior to that.
Right. So there's an extensive history in psychology, a lot of practical experience, and also inside knowledge of the NHS, obviously working there.
Yeah.
So as we briefly spoke, coming to 2020, it came as probably a bit of a shock to yourself what you were witnessing, yeah?
Well, yeah, because in my time as a psychologist in the NHS, I had worked alongside colleagues trying to challenge uh, biological psychiatry. I think there's a paradigm that dominates the mental health arena, which is all to do with biochemical imbalances in the brain that need medication to sort it out. And there's issues around human rights and lack of consent for treatment and so on, and overemphasis on biochemicals, i.e., medications. So I work with an enthusiastic group of people, not just providing therapy to my service users, but also trying to change that dominant model within the mental health system.
Yeah.
The irony was that I retired. I should have said I retired in 2013, and continued to work in that kind of anti-psychiatry movement, really. And then in 2020, when the COVID event started, I recognised very early doors. So in January 2020, I was writing stuff saying this is going in the wrong direction. This isn't right. Something's wrong here. And probably 90% of maybe even more, but 90% of my previous colleagues in fighting one tyranny in psychiatry just couldn't see this bigger tyranny that we were facing back in 2020.
Yeah.
And they had so many parallels, as you said, with consent and abuse of power and overuse of pharmaceuticals. It just seemed pretty obvious, And I think
What was going on?
And I think I wrote something back in the day called "A Tale of Two Tyrannies," and it seemed like the parallels were striking. And
Well, that's such an important point you make there, in that we automatically, and it's called the halo effect, isn't it? I think we automatically assume that when someone can do one thing in one area, that they'll be good in other areas.
mm,
So there is one of those biases where a lot of the time when you think, oh, well, someone's aware of that, they're going to be aware of pretty much all the things that are not adding up. But as we can quite clearly see, a lot of the groups having conflicts because some of them are aware of one thing but have different opinions on others, don't they? And that's what you were literally witnessing there, that they had the information to spot the errors that we would say is in the, you know, trying to fix the chemical imbalance. And I've looked into that myself, and obviously you've always got to ask cui bono, haven't you? Which, who benefits, who's the one? And a lot of treatments obviously come to what's profiting, isn't it? And that seems to be really pushing. Yeah, so it's a really important point there. So then you started seeing contradictions, and that made you more aware of some deeper things going on.
That's right, yeah. And you know, unfortunately, like I said, the large majority of my previous psychology colleagues had a different view, and we kind of grew apart, if you like, and that probably, you know, that's continued to this day. Some were very critical. I got quite a bit of verbal abuse, as I think that's we all did in those early days. But I could see from, you know, early 2020 that something was afoot, and this wasn't right. And I often ask myself, you know, how I picked up on that at that point in time. And I think there's probably a couple of things at least that played into that. And I think one, my doctorate research thesis back in 2020 was around risk and risk assessment, and particularly with regards to people who self-harm or engage in suicidal behaviour. And so I had a good grounding in risk and in risk aversion, and how poor not just the ordinary person in the street is, but professionals are in actually weighing up the relative risks of various options. So yeah. I think I had that as a good kind of starting point. I also had experience with my nursing career in particular, but also psychology, of interfacing with infection control departments over, you know, in the NHS. And although my impression was that they were very well-meaning, a significant number of them seemed to be very unrealistic and quite mono-focused in their advice giving. They didn't look at the bigger picture. So I kind of took those things together. Plus, also, I should say, which I think is I've been reflecting on this recently, but back in the day, back in the late 70s, early 80s, I was quite a proponent of behavioural psychology. I actually practiced a lot of behavioural therapy techniques. You know, people with phobias or obsessive compulsive problems. Sometimes with very good effect, I have to say. So I was quite into that.
Yeah, but that's another really important point you're making there, is that the whole intention of doing that was to heal your client. It wasn't to get your client to buy a product you were selling.
No. And
that's where a lot of, because people also have a lot of negative things to say about NLP, but again, it's a set of tools, and you can do really good things with those tools, or you can do really bad things with those tools. The problem, I think, with behavior science is so powerful, and people in power just want more power, as so often the case. There was another point I wanted to come to there, where you mentioned about the mono policies, and when we were speaking recently, you mentioned the bit about the sage saying that the young feel like they're at less risk. And that's true, isn't it? I mean, that clearly is a fact. So why is it in these mono policies they don't really care about the nuance or the grayness or facts? It's really, they just want compliance, don't they not, in these things?
I guess so. They do just get kind of fixated on one particular aspect, usually the one that they're interested in or know more about, potentially.
Yeah.
And obviously the classic was the COVID event, was, you know, it's just like a very blinkered view of what the virus was doing, what effect that was, and how we can control the virus, and everything else, all the collateral damage, all the ramifications of policy, which we both know have been hugely
and whether the policies worked or not really didn't come into it, did it? I mean, because we get onto the mask, because you obviously got a lot of expertise in that, but the walking in a restaurant with a mask, taking it off when you sit down, I mean, where's the logic?
there was absolutely no logic to it, was it? You know, the mask stuff was just completely nonsensical. You know, back in April 2020, prior to that, for years prior to that, there'd been a general recognition that in a pandemic you don't insist on masking healthy people. You know, you might want them to, you know, in NHS in certain situations, particularly the respirators that really, you know, they're really good good filtration, but as for, you know, cloth and plastic, there was never any indication in the pandemic plans that that was a, you know, that was a good thing to do, and the sound reason for that was that the evidence that they actually, you know, prevented viral transmission was pretty minimal, and all the, you know, the robust randomized controlled trials all suggested otherwise. And you know, the strange thing there, of course, was all the experts were talking sense up until about 7th of April, I think, around that time. You know, we had Van Tam and Jenny Harris and Whitty and everyone, politicians telling us, you know, don't wear, you know, healthy people, you know, don't start wearing masks, it won't do any good. And then around about May, June, it kind of flipped.
And then it become a religion in some ways. And it was, I mean, there's plenty of questions there. There's one thing where you talk to people and their general response would be, well, surgeons wear them.
Mm.
And of course, you would know as much as anyone else that they're not wearing them to protect themselves from viruses or to protect the patient from a virus.
Yeah. Surgeons use them to protect themselves from bodily fluids being splattered around, maybe to stop bits of that morning's breakfast falling from the surgeon into a wound or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And in virus labs, they've got the full body suits, haven't they?
Yeah.
You know, and of course, a mask doesn't cover the ears, it doesn't cover the eyes, it doesn't cover any orifice other than the nose and mouth, and it's not even doing a good job at that. I mean, there's been some great, it's like trying to hit a piece of sand with a tennis racket, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I often use in fact, I use the tennis net analogy, really. It's like, you know, trying to stop sand falling through a tennis net, you know, like kind of just ridiculous, really. But, you know, it switched rapidly from don't wear these things to, you know, they're mandated, you must, otherwise you're going to be fined. And that was
and this brings us on to starting to look at how behavioral science may have played a role, because there's certainly a lot of mutterings and a lot of suggestion that a lot of the people that knew it was not effective, but it was used more as a compliance signal.
I think that was one of the contributors. It's always hard to judge what the relative strength of that was compared to some of the other factors. I think there were certain things around politicians felt that they had to be seen to be doing something.
Yes.
In their world, they saw masking as a relatively cheap and easy and an intervention that didn't have really any negative consequences, which I would challenge very strongly.
Yeah, because I'd say that there's plenty of negatives.
More considerate of all the restrictions, in my view. That's why I've been very kind of energetic in opposing them. You know, through my Smile Free group, the group that's against any mandate for masks. You know, and if we continue to do that, because there's still pockets of the NHS that are persisting with these things.
I occasionally see someone now still wearing a mask in, you know, in the middle of March. It's and then
sorry, just before I forget, though, you mentioned the behavioural science elements of masks. I think it's worth pointing out at this early point in our conversation here that masks do strengthen a range of nudges that we've used on the British people throughout this COVID event. And the three they always talk about, you know, fear inflation, shaming, and peer pressure stroke scapegoating. So affect, ego, and normative pressure, to use the Mindspace document kind of term.
Well, there's a thing that I think most of the public still are not aware, that the Mindspace document exists, and you can search on any of the internet search engines, just type in Mindspace and government, and you'll get this document. And the subtext is, the subtitle says, influencing behavior through public policy, isn't it? Or influencing public policy through behavior, one of the two. But it's effectively a playbook for any government official to know which buttons to press in the public to influence them. And we could go as far as saying manipulation, because there's a lot of things in there where on page 66 they question whether it's ethical to do, you know, if the public finds out, they won't be happy. And on page 67, I think this is one of the most important things, and I wanted to talk to you about this, was that it will influence people's identities. And we want to be the captain of our own ships. I think it's one of the biggest drives of any member of the public to want to have control over themselves. And I don't think it's enough well known that there's a number of ways that we can be influenced subliminally and outside of our awareness to influence our decision, our beliefs, and then our identity, that it really does bring up a lot of ethical questions, doesn't it?
Well, that's right. And one of the co-authors of that Mindspace document was David Halpern, Professor David Halpern, who's in the lead at the Behavioural Insight team back at the Nudge Unit since its inception back in 2010, same year as that document was published. And in the Mindspace document, you know, they actually state very explicitly that these interventions should only be used with the permission of the public. If you don't have the permission of the public, you shouldn't be using them. And it's a message that David Alpern made again in his book, I think in 2018, Inside the Nudge Unit, being very explicit and very clear about it. These interventions should not be used on the public without their permission.
And then suddenly his ethics moved a little bit, did they?
Well, yes, although it's very difficult to know what's gone on in some ways because nobody seems to want to talk about it. I know I and many others, probably including yourself, David, have tried to open up debates about the ethics of nudging and behavioural science with the various key players, potentially key players. You know, back in January 21, you know, as you may recall, you know, I and many other psychological specialists wrote to our professional body in January 21, basically saying, well, you know, we are really concerned about the ethical basis of these interventions, these covert methods of influence that clearly have lots of actual damage and have been imposed on people without their consent. Now, you as the professional body, the British Psychological Society, what's your view on this? You know, do you agree with this? And to cut a long story short, they came back very stridently opposed to what we were saying that it wasn't unethical, you didn't need consent because these were population level interventions, that people's perception of the level of risk was perfectly proportionate with the risk of the virus. You know, and they were immensely proud of their psychologists.
Yeah, well, this is what happens, isn't it? Because there's a funny scene in Blackadder Goes Forth, where Melchard's talking about the German spies, and he says, you know, dirty backstabbing weasels, and then he mentions, oh, the British spy, great, wonderful, uplifting, you know, doing for Blighty. And it's almost that, isn't it? You know, as long as it's for the greater good, then we pretty much can do anything. And this is always the problem with ethics, is that with the right argument, some people can move the dial. And that's why I think it's really important that it's not internally focused, because, you know, any person decides, oh, I'm just going to cross that line, and then that's it. I mean, you know, the line's gone then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where do they stop?
I should say, I think it's reasonable to suggest that the British Psychological Society is somewhat conflicted in that there's quite a number of high-profile members, high-profile psychologists within the British Psychological Society who are also very much involved in the advisory groups and in the
Yeah.
application of behavioural science. So I think there is kind of a conflict there, to say the least. But it's not just the BPS, David. You know, we tried to get the cross-party committee, the PACAC, I think they're called, who do these in-depth, very good in the past, independent reviews, inquiries into particular issues. We tried in July 21, you know, open letter signed by all RAF, not just psychologists, but all medics, everybody, to try and say, this really needs looking at. We need to get into looking at the ethical basis of the way these behavioural science techniques have been applied. And they weren't interested. And then we had the COVID inquiry, of course, and their terms of reference have no mention at all of the behavioural science. And they don't have any mention of messaging, I don't think, of propaganda, you know. So it's a topic that's been totally ignored. Individuals who potentially have been key actors have explicitly denied any responsibility for inflating fear or using unethical practices. So
we're going to see this a lot, aren't we? Because, I mean, we've been, you know, I say when I come and saw you, we were talking about this concept of the adaptive unconscious and how the person can hide things from themselves, not always be aware of what they're doing. And what tends to happen is that people tend to cover their own backs, don't they? In hindsight, they very rarely. I think there was one actor I was watching him. He came out and said, and a pretty famous one, and he said, you know, I fell for the propaganda, and then I was really nasty to those that didn't, you know, follow the policies, and I'm sorry about that. But that's a rare instance.
Yeah, and I'd certainly respect any individual who does that so kind of transparently and admits and holds their hand up, you know, with genuineness and integrity. I think it takes a lot of courage to do that.
It does.
And sadly, you know, I think we all have to bear in mind. I think, and I always say this, that we have to keep in the back of our head that we all could be wrong, no matter what we're arguing.
Well, there's such an important point. It takes a certain amount of humbleness to say, you know, because I think certainty is one of the biggest problems we have, is that a lot of people pushing certain policies just claim to be absolutely certain, and they don't really have any data to base that certainty on. It's really just an emotional state of mind. Particularly when I debate people on Twitter, I see that, you know, to come up with a solution in 18 months that normally takes 10 years, you know, it's almost like, if you looked at it scientifically, they're trying to hit a moving target while blindfolded, and yet they think they can do it really accurately and nothing will ever go wrong. It's just not how anyone that really follows science would think, is it?
No, that's right. That's right. And I often reflect and think about what motivates some of the key players within this to continue to do what they're doing, and it's something that's very difficult to get any certainty about, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sure it varies from individual to individual. You know, I suspect that, like I said this the other week, that many of the behavioural scientists who've seen full on with this actually do believe they are doing good. You know, and I think they think they're saving.
Yeah. And that's a big part of motivated reasoning, isn't it? To spot that what you might be doing might be causing more harm than good. Really does make people, it's very challenging for people, and a lot of people tend to put their head in the sand, and that's what they see. So coming on to, so you were a big part of the Smile campaign, weren't you?
Smile Free, yeah,
Smile Free.
Yeah, just a small group of people that got together. I think it was in, I'm sure when it was now, actually, it might have been late 20, early 21, to oppose mask mandates. And we've been meeting weekly pretty much ever since. And you know, as a small group, again, you know, most people probably never heard of us, and you know, it's hard to get stuff out there, as you know, given the way the media is so kind of set up against alternative views to the dominant narrative. But we've continued, and I think we've done some good work, and we like to think we may have had some influence around the edges in the various mask crusade that the government went on in 2020. We've written open letters. We've recently contacted the NHS chief executives of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, basically saying, why are you continuing to
Yeah. And it needs that pressure. People don't realize how important that kind of pressure is, especially from professionals like yourself. I remember at one of the conferences I spoke at, a lady come up to me and she said she wanted to thank me for the work that we were doing, saying it enabled her to challenge one of the supermarkets, the smaller chains. And she kept pushing, and she mentioned legal stuff, and she got their mask mandates dropped in 24 hours. And it's just truly amazing what one person can do. And I think there's that quote, isn't it? If you don't think one person will make a difference, and you never slept with a mosquito in the room. The little person that we sometimes see ourselves as, we can do some pretty amazing things. And that's what so much of the propaganda was aimed at stopping, wasn't it? It was aimed at stopping people speaking up. It was censoring them when they did, to create this illusion of consensus.
Well, that's right. Yeah. I don't know whether he was the first person to coin that term, but Julius Seychelles, I think he was called, was a Canadian journalist talking about we've got to break the illusion of consensus, as you say, this idea that we're all predominantly on board with what's going on, because clearly that's not the case. But as pointed out, David, because we're all isolated, the opportunities to communicate, the censorship was huge, propaganda was huge, the nudging was huge. To speak against this dominant narrative instantly made you a bad person. You're hurting people. And fear levels were sky high and being strategically inflated using a variety of methods. So yes, there was that kind of concerted effort to stop people speaking to each other,
and which is so important, because if you don't see any contradictory information, then because there's this thing, isn't there, in the decision making, where you make the decision on the available information. Most people don't go searching for other information, because the assumption is that the media and the institutions will provide it to us. Now, if that's hidden, then people are making a decision that's going to be less than optimal for themselves, aren't they?
Well, that's right. And I think one of the big problems that we have in the UK and in the Western world generally is that we've still got this belief delusion, really, that our institutions are the kind of beacons of the world, that they can be trusted, unlike China and Russia and some of these authoritarian regimes, that our institutions, whether they be around health, public health, education, the military complex, etc., the West, where we can trust what
it's a lovely fairy tale, isn't it?
It is. We can no longer do that, and I think a lot of people are struggling. Talking about my impression with, talking to acquaintances and friends, is that just that kind of idea that our own trusted institutions could be actually exploiting us.
It's so strong, isn't it? It's so strong in people's minds that couldn't happen here. And you could take look at the Harvard recently, where Harvard's motto is Veritas, truth. And I think it was the head, wasn't it, was plagiarizing things, and then they've just fired Martin Kudoff for basically speaking the truth because it went against narrative. And he's like, well, so it's almost like the brand doesn't match the behavior anymore, does it?
No, and I can understand why that is quite scary for people and really unsettling for people to really get their heads around. I still find it unsettling now, and kind of I've been sort of resigned to it since 2020. But once you see it, the gross lies that were told in start of the COVID event, and once you actually see it and start doing your own research and start digging into these things, you realise how many other areas of life, past and present, there's always
Well, that's what they've done, haven't they? They've inadvertently made people look deeper at society, because if you're, I know I consulted a lot of corporations, and certainly there was something we witnessed where during the pandemic, most people that were self-employed generally asked questions. And this is a generalization, and it's not true of everything, but a lot of people that worked in a corporation generally just followed the policies, because you're so, in a big corporation, you're so used to it, because you have like a legal team, you have a HR, you have these teams that have expertise in their area, and you just literally defer because it's simpler, and they should be more knowledgeable. And that's what I think a lot of people defaulted on. You know, I'm going to trust the experts, which generally is a wise thing to do, but are the experts that can be trusted? Whereas if you're a self-employed person, you're used to thinking for yourself, having to organize things, that you go, right, is this the right pathway for me? And I think that's what the point you made is, that so many people are now going, hang on a minute, what I thought was the case, where I thought, and one of the biggest things, people think there's all these checks and balances, and we only got to look at like the MHRA. Was it 86% funded by the pharmaceutical industry? You don't bite the hand that feeds you. Didn't they even say that they were no longer regulators and more enablers?
That's right. That's what the lead, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but that's what she actually said, that we are now enablers. You know, that's supposed to be the regulatory body. It's supposed to be acting on our behalf to keep us safe.
So they're supposed to be on our side, but it's that's a kind of simple flip that I don't think people are aware of. So the regulators should be working for us. We should be the stakeholder, but in fact, they're now funded by the pharmaceutical industry. The same with the media now. And the media, go back 40, 50 years ago, their money came from people buying media. So the stakeholder, i.e. the people with the vested interest, the customer, the people that you can't piss off, for want of a better word, was the public. But now the media essentially is advertising revenue and their owners. So they're no longer really representing the public. And that's what people don't realize, is the forces at play have changed considerably in everything.
Yeah, so probably a good example of that, David, was obviously back in 2020, you know, at the start of the COVID events, when you know, the biggest advertiser with the media companies was the government. You know, they stopped running up their adverts because nothing was open. So, you know, it was dependent upon the government funding, and not to mention, obviously, some of the other dubious interference by government into activities of various media.
So when people say, if that was true, it'd be in the news, that's not valid, if it ever was, but it's certainly not valid now, because we did a freedom of information request to Ofcom, and it was basically, if you said anything that made people question the medical procedure, then it was taken off air. And YouTube have it in their terms and conditions. And in fact, there was that paper published recently in Curious, which I'm sure you're aware of, and a paper usually has something like 2,500 views. That had 300,000 views, and then it was retracted, right? But wasn't retracted because of the data, by the looks of it. And of course, but what that had the effect of doing was, there's a doctor who, I think her channel is called Dr. Boz, and she's got 600,000 subscribers, and she then made a video going through this paper line by line, and she had her experts look at it, and they couldn't find anything wrong with it. And she's like, right, I've been played here, I've been misled. And that video itself, she then got demonetized. And her next video looked at the bits in the YouTube terms and conditions, and it doesn't say if you lie or make anything like a factual around that medical procedure. It's if you make any comment that would dissuade someone from taking it. So it doesn't matter if it's true. It's just, and that's where when you look at the terms and conditions now, it's effectively, is this going to lose our sponsors' money? It's not, is it true, is it not true? Because so many of the things that were censored were actually verifiably true, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and
Yeah.
we had was it the counter disinformation unit? You know, it had what did they call it? A trusted flag status, something along those lines, whereby they were saying we don't interfere with what the media put out or the social media put out. No, we don't get involved like that. But we do have this trusted flagger status or something similar, like that.
Yeah.
Which give them this priority kind of influence, because what they had was like a direct line to all the social media companies, so that if there was anything the government didn't like, they could go, look at this.
Yeah.
We're just
And
talking, so we're not threatening or anything. You
yeah,
know.
yeah. And I remember talking to Mel Nass about this, and you'd have like a published medical article get flagged as fake news by some 20 something sitting in his mother's basement. It was truly incredible. I remember I had posted a published medical study around the effect of vitamin C, and this guy fact checked it and posted it almost. And I said, do you realize one is literally a published medical article and the other one is some guy's opinion? And when you looked into a lot of the fact checkers, they were literally just, minimum wage people sitting, no qualifications. And you effectively had them like, what do we need to have the opinion, not what's true? And so many people relied on the fact checkers to dismiss your argument because they didn't want to think that they were lied to. I mean, when everyone's going on this ship, you don't want to think this ship is heading for the iceberg.
No.
Yeah, so truly incredible. So you've been doing a lot of work recently. Is it okay to talk about the recent project?
Yes, please. Yeah, I've been
Excellent.
involved since probably July last year in doing some research with the support of Panda, the Panda organisation, basically looking at nudging, and as used by the British government during the COVID event, how they infused a lot of the COVID messaging with nudges that inflated fear, inflated shame, and kind of encouraged scapegoating, really. And the main questions I was trying to answer were like, who was responsible for actually producing those kinds of messages, the ones that scared, shamed, and encouraged scapegoating? Who were the politicians, the ministers, the civil servants, the advertising companies, and of course, most importantly, in my world, the behavioural scientists who actually were inputted into that. And we focused on what is arguably the most kind of contentious of COVID messaging campaigns, was the look them in the eyes adverts, which I'm sure everybody remembers, where you're focusing on
Pretty distressing, weren't they?
Acutely unwell patients, near to death, would appear in the intensive care units, on the respirator, ominous music, all the staff completely kind of geared up with their protective equipment, and this voiceover saying, look them in the eyes and tell them you're doing everything you can to prevent the spread of coronavirus. So fear inflating and shaming, that primarily. A lot of other nudges in there as well along
and there's no mention of any scientific data or facts. It's purely just going for the jugular in emotion, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. So we had a good dig into this, do a whole raft, dozens of freedom of information requests, and very time-consuming sifting through all the outputs of the various government committees and the potential key players to find out who was responsible. And I'm pleased to say that last week we've got my article into a journal, the Self and Society journal, that's published the initial results. And just for brevity, there's a lot of detail in there, but 5 key findings, which I'll just quickly run through, if that's all right, David.
Absolutely. And we'll put a link to the paper in the comments, as we will your SMILE campaign as well.
That'd be brilliant. So we confirmed what I suspect many of us had been previously believed, and that was first key finding that behavioural science is ubiquitous within the country, within UK. This is government funded UK.
And what does that mean to the public?
What
So
that means is that pretty much everything that you do, every domain of your life, will likely have some influence being kind of put on it by these nudges. So we find them in not just the advisory groups during the COVID event, not just at the behavioural insight.
So we could basically say there's almost a Darren Brown working in every part of government, working out how they can get you to do what they want you to do.
That's right. And I'll just give you an example. If you just we've got the advisory groups, we have the nudge unit, we've got the government communication service, which again is a huge conglomerate, 7,000 professional communicators. They have their own behavioural science team, but in addition to all that, within departments, they all tend to have their own in-house behavioural scientists. So, for instance, back in 2019, there were 54 working in revenues and customs. There are 24 this year working in the UK Health Security Agency. So these are full-time behavioural scientists in-house. Work and pensions department 16, transport 6. There's a small group in the cabinet office, a small group in health and social care, a small group in the office of health improvement
and it's fair to say that each of those people are going to be given a remit that they're just going to pretty much fulfill. They're not going to question, right? So they might say, right, we want everyone to eat, this, and they're going to work out the best way of doing that. Not should people be eating this, or is this the healthy way, or etc.
Right.
And if they're fed faulty information, then it's not really theirs to question. They're just going to carry on finding the best way to get you to do what they want you to do.
Exactly. Yeah. So what the research has done, I think, has been useful. It's quantified it, in a very detailed way, and obviously people can read the details in the actual journal paper. The second key finding is that we've identified the actors directly responsible for the Look Them in the Eyes campaign. So, in brief, this is a senior civil servant called Conrad Bird. Not whether I hadn't heard of him before, but he's the main commissioner for these adverts, and has written quite widely about them, and acknowledges that he's the lead, as does the Cabinet Office. The behavioural scientists responsible, it seems that some of the more high-profile ones were not directly responsible for this particular set of advert. The main kind of behavioural science source was from this Cabinet Office group of in-house behavioural scientists who offered direct advice to Conrad Bird, who was ultimately responsible for the sign-off of the Look Them in the Eyes campaign. Well, you might have guessed Matt Hancock. Graham Hancock was the person who signed and said this is fine, we can go with this. And Mullen-Law was the advertising company who received multi-million pounds for producing that, and no doubt had their own behavioural science team within their company as well. So it's absolutely crawling with nudges, and I don't know. It's an irony, isn't it? As taxpayers, we're paying our government to employ people.
We're paying them to basically condition us.
Well, that's right. The third implication, which I won't go into, third key finding, which I won't go into any detail, but I confirm that despite their protests of innocence, the prominent behavioural scientists within the SPIB, remember the SAGE subgroup of behavioural scientists, psychologists, and others who were advising the government on the communication campaign. If you look at their outputs along with the nudge unit and behavioural insight team, even though personnel in both those groups have said, no, we never use fear, we never do this. Some even deny ever using nudging. actually, which is an interesting one. But the evidence suggests that that's not the case, and I have detailed, examples of them using fear, of them using ego nudges around equating following the restrictions and getting vaccinated with being a good person, and normative pressure, which kind of this.
And then the gaslighting of anyone that's been injured.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like they don't exist, and that normative pressure, people don't realize how very powerful that is.
Mm.
Someone's only got to make a video of how they were injured and it will be taken down.
Yeah.
How can they say that's not true? It's the person's experience.
Yeah. I think we can all kind of identify with what it feels like to have normative pressure focused upon you. I think, for example, I know I've had this experience, I'm sure you have, David, but being in a crowded room of mass people, not while you're
Yeah,
it's not the most comfortable place to be. That's
yeah. You get. I remember having it on the train where this young 20-year-old woman just gives us this dirty look and then stomps off up the carriage. And it's like, wow. But that's the thing, you can't reason with people when they're in that sort of emotional state.
Well, the two key findings that I think are the most astonishing, most powerful in my book anyway, and maybe a little bit astonishing, and that is that we actually looked and found out what the official justification was from that group of Cabinet Office people. So this was a response to freedom of information request to the Cabinet Office. So the Cabinet Office eventually, which I won't go into, but it made a long process, eventually confirmed what their some of their reasons for putting out these adverts. Okay. There were three really main ones that jumped out at me. One was the existence of what they call a complacent minority who weren't skilled enough. So that's basically the one group. Let's target this group that are kind of thinks that the risk is being exaggerated, blah blah blah. And that was all kinds of implications about could we really say that the group was complacent, given for the vast majority of people, the fatality and the rate for SARS-CoV-2 was very small.
Even Billy's come out now and admitted that, hasn't he? He's literally on record now as saying wasn't as dangerous as we thought, and blah blah blah, and it's like the flu but different. But exactly. People don't see that.
Yeah, but also, of course, for me, even if you could identify a group who were complacent, to then scare and shame everybody, to try and influence them. I remember that the remainder, large majority would have been already overly scared by that point.
Yeah.
To actually shame and scare those, I think, really does raise some ethical questions.
I mean, should a government be scaring its public? Shouldn't it be telling the truth and letting the public? I mean, and then you come up to questions about, but where's the freedom?
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's ethically highly dubious to use fear or shame or peer pressure for that matter, because it's like your government, the people that we pay for, are actually strategically using emotional discomfort to you to think and behave the way they want you to.
Yeah.
And that sounds very authoritarian in my book. So,
and if they were literally using actual solid science, they'd have more of a case. But a lot of it wasn't, was it? It was literally, there was like, where did we get that 2 meter rule from? Oh, we just sort of plucked it out of the air.
Yeah.
And then suddenly everyone's changing their behaviors. It's going to ripple through for decades.
Right. But the other two justifications, I think, are even more kind of shocking in a way. This is from the Cabinet Office, so this is I've got this documented in an FOI. Another justification was that younger people perceive themselves to be less at risk. Sounds like a
rightly so.
Yeah, exactly. No shit, Sherlock. I think was my response when I read that. And thirdly, in January 2021, which was when the Look Them in the Eyes adverts were launched, just around the time of the second lockdown, if you recall, their third one of their well, the third justification was that people weren't as scared in
as
June
they were.
as they were in March 2020. You know, and they come out with some awful, well, in my opinion, anyway. You know, and I'll read some of the things that they said, David. I think this is important. You know, level of perceived risk is not as high as March 2020. March a shock to the system, but now have learned to live alongside COVID. Strong evidence of COVID fatigue across the sample. They have settled into their own level of acceptable behaviour that fits their lifestyle, their specific needs and circumstances. We're fearful, but much less panic this time round. So what that's shouting at me is, oh yeah, they're all still scared, but they're not scared enough, you know.
Yeah, but it's also they've weighed up whether they want to live the rest of their life stuck in a room or whether they actually want to live.
Hot on, yeah.
And these people are saying it's really don't come down to control. They somehow think that they have the right to control your life.
Mm.
Who are these people? And I know I've seen a number of people asking this question, making this point. Like, who gives them the right? You know, and that's when they do they think they own everyone?
Mm. Yeah.
Truly incredible, astonishing. Well, I mean, I think people are going to really enjoy reading through that. And there was one more, wasn't there? One more.
The fifth one, again, perhaps not too surprising, but it's always good to confirm it, is that there was no ethical oversight whatsoever into the making of the look them in the eyes campaign. Basically, what they said was that you know, they had their own little qualitative research, they call it, which is like in-house.
The tick boxing exercise, you mean?
Finally, they asked panels of 6 lay people, you know, to watch the adverts, and it would appear that unless somebody kind of screams up and goes, "Oh, these are horrendously unethical," then they assume that no ethical input.
Would they though, or would they just choose another 6 people? Like
they might they? And again, I'll quote what the Cabinet Office said. Ethical approval on government campaigns is not a standard requirement. There was a reliance on audience testing via insight research to inform developments and ensure accuracy of message takeout. And this is a good one. Research findings did not indicate that additional non-standard approvals, such as ethical approval, were required. So it could absolutely.
But this is the thing with this emergency authorization stuff. It just allows them to bypass most safety testing, most regulation, most ethical thing. It's just right. It's a free fall, guys. Do what you need to do, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And that was. And let's point out that's not because there was any shortage of ethicists around. There were a lot of ethical specialists. There was a group, the MEAG, you know, the Moral Ethical Advisory Group, that was within the government infrastructure throughout the COVID event, met about, well, at least a couple of dozen times, probably more during that period, but were ignored or thwarted. And there were lots of national ethical institutions who were producing lots of stuff throughout the COVID event. Nuffield Centre being probably the better known one. And some of the ethical stuff produced was sound stuff, but obviously it never
just ignored. So what I think would be really good, I think your paper is important for a number of reasons. It's now there, it's on public record. I think there's a dissection of what's gone on that needs to be done. And I think in doing that, because that question, are we the captain of our own ships? If we can be influenced subliminally and unconsciously, then that's important for the public to know. And I think once they do begin to understand the level of this science, and it is a science now, it's not as it used to be, which was theorizing. They've got, I mean, effectively, I was talking to someone about this yesterday. They run hundreds of scenarios and they mess around with the variables, and they see that when we change this variable, this person's opinion or behavior will change. As an example, they found that if a person in the movie they were watching spilt the coffee, then the people watching it felt more positive towards them. Okay. But then when they were asked if that had any effect, they said no. So there's things that can affect you, but you won't know they're affecting you. And because they've studied so many hundreds of different variations of that, they've almost got this checklist. Oh, well, this is going to work, but the person won't know it's going to work. So this is going to be really effective. And when the public starts to find out about that, then they're going to look at corporations. They're certainly going to look at fast food, because I can tell you a few of those big corporations are really playing around with things. And I think when people know about this, then they can become the captain of their own ship more. Because if we think we've got a default of complete, self-will and free will, knowing the bits that we can't control actually gives us more free will, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's one of the key.
Yeah, and for me, like the three, just very, very briefly, the three ethical kind of cornerstones. That doesn't make sense. Cornerstones, triangulation of the three ethical
Principles.
That's it. Well, for me, the public need to be made aware of methods.
Yeah.
Using fear, shame, emotional discomfort, and all the collateral damage associated with that. Goals. Should we be using, or should our government be using these strategies, these often covert strategies, towards the fulfillment of, at best, highly dubious, non-evidenced, often counterproductive goals like lockdowns, school closures, mass rape, etc.
We're not in a cost of living crisis. We're in a cost of lockdown crisis, aren't we?
And consent, the big one in the way. As how do you get public's consent? Like I said, Professor David Alpern, very clear. These techniques should not be used without the targets.
And we wouldn't consent. If you said, right, can you let me scare the shit out of you to make you do what I want you to do? It's going to be no.
Well, I think generally it would. There may be, I'm trying to be balanced. There may be like specific circumstances where
if you went to a personal trainer, or if a client come to you and they were struggling with something, and you said to them, "Look, I can use this science, and it may, influence you." That is a totally, because a lot of this actually, in the origins of some of the techniques did come from therapy, and that's in a room where you've got the trust and you've got. And as the practitioner, your goal is to make your client better, not to sell them something, or not to get them to be just a good little citizen. And that's where intention is so important in this, isn't it?
Yes, right. I totally agree, David. Another example often pops to my mind is like when you go to a weight loss group or something, or a weight loss society, where it's made very explicit, to try and enable you not to eat as much and do more exercise. We do use these techniques, and this is what they involve. This is what it will be. This is what we're trying to achieve. You may feel like this, blah blah blah. Do you consent? Is that something that you're happy for us to do? I think there are little niches like that which you could perhaps
exactly, and those nudges would be you move the chocolates away from being at the till, you put the salads in it, and they do have a big effect. There's one I saw the other day where they gave people a recipe on entering a supermarket in Holland, and the recipe had healthy trigger words, and the people that were on a diet bought a lot less junk food. The people that weren't on a diet, it didn't affect them at all because it wasn't their goal. But these things really can work for good. And obviously, but then the consent's important. But if you were wanting to lose weight, you would say, yeah, I'm okay with a non-fearful, simple strategy that's going to help me get to my goal. Yeah, brilliant.
That's miles away from the government using these tactics on everybody, isn't it? I mean, that's the
yeah, it's totally different. It's not even a ballpark. I want to thank you for your time, Gary. I think the paper that you've had published is very important, and hopefully will spur a lot more work. We'll put the links below where people know where they can reach you. And let's understand what's happened, and let's try and make sure that going forward, we really have more power in the public, and we don't have people pushing non-scientific policies as though they are science.
Yeah, that will be good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gary. Ciao, ciao.